Hi, and welcome to the Azure podcast. This is episode 445, being recorded on November the 2nd, 2022. I'm Russell Young, and I'm joined by Cynthia and Sujit and Russell, and our special guests, Pankaj Meshram and Matt Ely. We'll kick off first off with a couple of updates from Azure as normal. Over to you, Cynthia, if you've got a couple to take us through there.
Sure. I have one that I thought was really interesting. It's around our improvements on efficiency in our Microsoft data centers. There's actually data sheets across a number of different countries and regions, and this is really targeting towards our goal to become carbon negative by 2030. And there's also a number of other goals that I learned about, like different scopes of emissions very recently. There's scope 1, 2, and 3. This is, if you're interested, is something definitely to look into. I think it's really cool how they're kind of categorized. We also, throughout these reports, you'll find out about how we are efficient and how we're increasing our use of PUE as well as WUE. I believe one is around how efficient we're using our power, the closer power usage effectiveness, as well as water usage effectiveness. And these are metrics that we continue to track. And there's also another initiative around that is called the circular centers, which are usually built really close to our existing data centers. And when we have equipment that needs to be decommissioned, then it moves to the circular centers. And we look at what are parts we can continue to reuse and what are parts that we need to recycle, and really getting towards that circular economy that we're really not creating a lot of waste.
Yeah, it's amazing how much we're doing in that area. Actually, we did discuss the PUE thing a little bit in last episode when we were talking about the Mark Razinovich session. So if you missed that, it's worth catching up on. It was a really interesting discussion and covering some of that liquid cooling and stuff that's being innovated in data centers as well.
Yeah.
You got another one there, Cynthia, about ACS? No?
Yeah,
well, there's one I spotted as well. So there was a thing about Azure Communication Services, and we've got a general availability of the short code functionality now in SMS. So that service, the Azure Communication Services, for those that haven't come across it before, is a really great way of sending out and receiving and dealing with different communications mechanisms, and SMS is one of them. Yeah, there's just a new edition of this short code functionality, which helps with some scenarios around authentication and some other bits and pieces. Sujit?
Yep. So I have one on AKS, which, as you all know, is my favorite topic. AKS, typically, if you deploy it, Microsoft will deploy the nodes with an Ubuntu image if you're doing the Linux variant of AKS. And that's been the only option, and you can't really change that, customize that image. But what they have just announced now is you have an option of switching to the Mariner image, which, as you know, is the underlying image that's used in a number of other Azure services today. It's a hardened kernel, Linux kernel that Microsoft has put out in the open source, and it continues to drive most of our Azure services. And so now, if you want, you can swap the Ubuntu image off the nodes and replace it with the Mariner image, which is, I mean, from a security perspective, they're all hardened. It's just more lightweight. I think, it's just got the bare minimum components on it. And of course, that means that the security attack surface is reduced. So that's an option for AKS, which I just happened to hear of earlier today. A customer of mine was thinking about it, and I was like, okay, it's available now in public preview. So take a look at that if AKS is what you use.
Cool. A couple more that caught my eye. One was a public preview feature for Azure Maps. And this is the ability for you to describe in JSON the inside of your buildings and things like that. So I thought that was quite interesting. That's part of the Azure Maps Creator functionality. And the last one, which is kind of like an interesting segue onto our guest today, was the public preview of SAP S/4HANA events being made available on Azure Event Grid. So I don't know, Matt and Pankaj, if you know anything about that one, but it's exposing quite a lot of the internal events and things that SAP exposes, I think, through Event Grid for event-driven functionality. You're nodding away. Is there anything you can add to that one? Do you know about that feature? I guess, Pankaj, you've been using it or working on it?
So do you mean the one which we announced with the Teams connection with adaptive card-based loop components, where we're exposing the APIs for Teams connections? Effectively, what it means is even there's no context switching for the end users, which is where, let's say, for example, if there is a CRM system that a particular user is using, or as they're having a sales call, and they want to log the call and they want to schedule a meeting after that call, they don't need to switch a context from the SAP system. They can in fact schedule the same with using these Teams APIs. And that was one of the announcements back then from Ignites as well.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, it sounds like that's probably enabled by the same functionality. It's all part of the same scenario with events flying all over the place. So thank you, and sorry to put you on the spot, but maybe you can introduce yourself and then hand over to Matt to introduce himself and start talking about your SAP Accelerator.
Absolutely. So Pankaj Meshram, I'm part of Worldwide Customer Success Unit in Microsoft, where we look after the tech strategy across all the different workloads. So the core Azure landing zones and the specialized workloads as well. As part of my role, I look after SAP on Azure as tech strategy lead for the workload. And my role is kind of divided into 4 pillars, where we look into platform improvements, which are the signals coming from the customers. We look into tech intensity, which is effectively what the field is lacking in terms of upcoming products and services, and where we could enable them so that they can have a better conversation with all of the customers, and effective conversation with the customers. And then we look into something which we call as SAP Landing Zone Acclerator. That is our solution engineering project. So I'm sure, Russell, you know about the Azure Landing Zone piece, which is the core best practice recommendations and automation for Azure Landing Zone. And then we have this workload specific landing zone on top of it, which is SAP or AVS or HPC, AVD. So that's one of the things that I look after. And finally, into customer success, which is global customers and escalations and any blockers that we could remove for the customers. What do you, Matt?
Thanks very much. So Matt Ely, I sit in the Global Partner Solutions team, covering SAP on Azure from a technical perspective. Primarily, my role is to work with UK-based customers to help them bring as much value as they can to customers. Sorry, UK-based partners to help them bring as much value as they can to customers. That could cover anything from how to deploy and manage SAP systems effectively, which the Landing Zone Accelerator and the automation framework really talks to, through how we work around the SAP system, so how we integrate it with data solutions or security solutions like Sentinel to get the most value out of it.
I know what Cynthia is going to talk about. Landing Zone Accelerators is very close to her.
So Pankaj, I used to lead the APIM as well as the Azure Landing Zone Accelerator. So I sit on like a parallel team to you before I left Microsoft. But question for Pankaj, I know the environment was one of the challenges with the SAP Landing Zone Accelerator, where it really requires a lot of resources. I'm curious from that aspect, when a customer or just anyone that wants to understand how that works, are there any constraints around the subscription they have to be able to fully experience what the Landing Zone Accelerator offers, or are there any intermediate steps before going full-blown deployment? And then also a question for Matt. I know when we built out the Landing Zone Accelerators, we had a specific type of customer in mind. I'm curious, for a partner, do they use these Landing Zone Accelerator differently, or can they just take it out of the box and really work with their customers as well?
Cool. So I noticed we have been mentioning about landing zone as a word, but I'm sure our audience would be extremely curious to understand what exactly is meant by landing zone, right? And one of the best examples that we often use to define this is, even before the houses are built in a society, in a place, you need access to all the common sort of utilities, right? Power, gas, electricity, all this sort of common utilities. And this is what we are referring to as Azure Core Landing Zone. So which is effectively, how do you define all the services when it comes to Azure Core Landing Zone? How does your network subscription looks like? How does your management looks like? How does your identity and access management looks like? How does your security looks like? So what are these common components? So the definition of these components, the best practices, recommendation on these components, and the build of these components using automation is effectively your core Azure landing zone. That's what we are referring to. And then when we are building houses on top of it, then we are customizing the houses. Like you have a certain set of houses and they have certain names for certain houses based on all developers. So we have like SAP landing zone, and we have AVS and HPC. So if you look at the overall picture of the landing zone, if you can imagine 3 boxes. So the first box is your Azure core landing zone. This is where 50% of the best practices are coming in, which would be applicable to everything. It would be applicable to all the kind of different resources that the customer is looking to migrate into Azure, right? And then about 30% is based on the SAP specific considerations, because SAP on Azure runs in a specific way. There are certain recommendations, VMs, recommendations on networking, recommendations on BCDR, recommendations on identity and access management. So what are these things that we have learned from our customer implementations over the years? So that is effectively the 30%. And then we also say 20% headroom on top of it, which is effectively because all the customers' landscape will be a little bit different. They will be using different third-party solutions. Some will have bespoke solutions, and we want to give this room to plug in those kind of solutions into our overall landing zone solution.
Thanks, Pankaj. Just to address the question of how partners can use the SAP Landing Zone Accelerator, actually chiming in really well with what you were saying there about the proportion, which is the same every time. We think that approximately 50% of the code base will be used in every single SAP on Azure deployment. However, for the remaining 50%, partners can build their own IP really well, because about 30% of that, so 30% overall, could be used in a repeatable way by a partner. Whereas you say that top 20% is going to be bespoke for each customer, and SAP, each customer's usage of SAP can vary to quite a large extent. What that means is there's quite a high knowledge floor on using the Landing Zone Accelerator. You need to do quite a lot of understanding and building out before it can be useful. So it probably isn't going to be useful, or the target audience isn't really a basis architect that's deploying 1 or 2 SAP systems. It's much more likely to be useful for an organization that's going to deploy tens or hundreds of SAP systems over the course of a year, which is exactly where our partners that are moving SAP systems to Azure, or spinning up or spinning down SAP systems on Azure on a regular basis for their customers, where their niche is.
That's really interesting, actually. So one of my questions for Pankaj was going to be what's so special about the SAP part of the Landing Zone Accelerator, and what value does it add, and how much time does it save if it's something that you're only doing once every, so many years or what have you. But I guess, Matt, you've answered that from the partner and the repetition perspective. But isn't SAP just another workload that you can just deploy up into Azure? What is the extra stuff that you're adding? What's the complexity behind what value you're bringing via the accelerator?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, Russell. So if you look at the SAP systems on any customer's landscape, right? Pick up any customer, you would usually find SAP in some of the biggest and largest corporations around the world, managing their business operations using various modules from the SAP software, and then these SAP systems are always the most mission-critical applications in a customer's landscape. You can think of them as the crown jewels in a customer's landscape. And the migration and movement of these SAP systems is probably one of the most complex tasks, needs to be carefully planned. All the considerations and recommendations needs to be carefully adopted before moving the SAP systems. And just to give an example, right, if there is a customer who is looking for networking recommendations, they can go into a best practice recommendation. For example, any customer who is having global operations, then what kind of architecture they should focus on, which would pertain to Azure vWAN sort of architecture. Think about accelerated networking enablement. Think about right accelerator for the premium SSD, for the log of SAP HANA database. And these are very niche and specific recommendations that makes the workload successfully run on Azure, right? And that's why it is important that all these important, and this is just an example, we have a big list of recommendations when it comes to the critical design areas, but this is where it is helping our customers. So, even before they think that there's a huge amount of complexity, here we go, customer, these are all the recommendations available, these are the checklists available, please have a look at it. And we have an automation available as well, which will help you to accelerate your project in terms of deployment. So rather than deploying SAP systems manually and having that man hours and project hours delaying the project, here we are giving the accelerators. That's why we call it as Landing Zone Accelerator.
Yeah, thank you.
Question for both Matt and Pankaj. How does the experience for a brownfield customer or partner differ from a greenfield customer or partner?
I can take that unless you want to talk about it, Matt.
No, you go first.
Okay. So the way we have designed the Landing Zone Accelerator is something which is applicable to both greenfield and brownfield customers. And I'll give you a couple of examples. We were working on a POC with one of the customers where they already had the VNets in place, they had the subnets in place, they had the naming conventions in place, and then we were also able to modify our code, reuse and remove all the default naming conventions and deployment. So effectively using ARM IDs and resource group IDs into our code, and then deploy resources into the specific customer subnet. So that's an example of brownfield. Of course, greenfield is much easier in this case because you can pick it up off the shelf and deploy.
Yeah, no, I'd say that covers it off. Bear in mind, there's various different ways to do brownfield, and some say where you create the system and then do a system copy to replicate the old one and move it across. That's going to be less complicated. Again, speaks to exactly the customizable elements, and each customer has a different history behind them and a different path ahead of them, and that's why you need that headroom to customize the accelerator on each and every use.
Yeah. Another important point around the same question, Cynthia, is if you look at some of the larger customers, they have different projects going on, right? They just won't have any one single SAP landscape. They might have different SAP landscape, different projects all over the world. And depending on what kind of SLAs is required, RTO, RPO requirements, the architecture differs. And that's why best practice recommendations are extremely important, because we are telling them, we are giving them all the different permutation and combinations. Let's say if you want to deploy an availability zone, think about X, Y, Z, think about these things. If you are using availability sets, think about these things. So that's what it's pertaining to when it comes to even brownfield customers as well.
One of the reasons why these landing zone accelerators help customers is to prevent them from shooting themselves in the foot, right, when trying to deploy something. But at the same time, I can see over here that you've got a ton of customization that's possible, right, with all the various aspects. So I guess the question is, can the customer still shoot themselves in the foot if they go a little bit wonky on all of these customizations?
Yeah. So Landing Zone Accelerator is obviously going to help to build, right, to help to accelerate the build of SAP systems. But then there are certain steps which we call as post steps or operations, or which once you have SAP system up and running. Specifically, when you look at the go live for SAP systems, there are multiple moving components, right? You have the various sort of user acceptance testing, you have stress testing, you have the load testing, you have business acceptance testing, all these different things going on at the same place, right? So I think from project perspective, if all those things are carefully planned, I mean, we have seen so many successful go lives. We have also seen places where we have learnings from after the go live, and we have stabilized systems. So there is always this period of 3 to 4 weeks where we are sort of hypercaring the SAP system and looking at it and learning from it as well.
Yeah, no, bear in mind if you're automating 80% of it, that's you've got 5 times less of an opportunity to shoot yourself in the foot. Certainly, when we talk about doing this repeatably at either customers or partners, the fact that you customize it in advance and use it in the same way each time, you know the bits that you use in the same way each time are going to work consistently. And then bear in mind that there's best practice embedded into this regardless, with things like security and policy, and that will put in the checks and balances that take away your ability to shoot yourself in the foot in certain areas, unless you're trying really hard.
So security, I think, is one of the things I kind of don't take it for granted, but I kind of assume that it's going to be built into these landing zones, and that's part of why you have it. Is there, to make sure you've got your workloads well looked after and ring fenced from a basic security perspective. But are there any additional benefits that customers will get by migrating to Azure and using these accelerators, like maybe some monitoring that they wouldn't have before, or anything like that? Any additional features that come almost for free as part of the platform?
Yeah, I think Sujit mentioned a very important point, and that's something which I always refer as configuration drift, right? When customers are doing it manually, or we are doing it manually, there's always a chance that I might configure an SAP system differently than what Matt is configuring, depending on our own individual experiences. But when we are using the code, it's a consistent, repeatable, same outcome which you're going to get. And one of the good examples is, let's say, pacemaker clusters, right? There are so many settings when it comes to pacemaker clusters. And even within that, when you're looking at Red Hat Flair or SLES flavor, then you have, again, different settings coming on that. But we have embedded all of those things based on our documentation that what we recommend. So all those settings are already part of our code, right? So that is avoiding all the configuration drift for the customers. Now, that's the first phase. Going forward as a roadmap, what we are also looking is to see how we can help with the management and operations when it comes to running these systems on Azure. So we have a solution called Azure Monitor for SAP solutions, which is used for monitoring specifically SAP systems. How can we provide that as a plug-and-play after automation? So after build of SAP systems, how can we do it as a plug-and-play solutions, as a turnkey solution, right? Similarly, Matt mentioned about system copies. So we're also trying to look into that if there are certain aspects of system copies we can automate. We also mentioned about Azure Center for SAP Solutions in the Ignite announcement, which is effectively giving you integrated experience of deployment through Azure portal. That is another important piece of the puzzle. And what it also does is helps to register these SAP systems on Azure, and then that helps us to provide the right kind of monitoring and management for all these SAP systems.
What do we get when we deploy a Azure Landing Zone Accelerator for SAP? Like, is it infra? Is it code? Is it a combination of both?
Yeah, so it's a combination of both. If we look at the automation, the way it's built, it's two-part. One is Terraform, and the second piece is Ansible. Terraform is being used to deploy all the infrastructure components on Azure. So also your VNets, subnets, disk, storage, compute, all those sort of components. And Ansible is being used to build the SAP systems on top of the VM. So you will install SAP system on the VM. That's exactly what Ansible is doing. So it's all doing configuration part of the SAP system, so build of SAP system on top of it.
I think you may have inadvertently answered my question. I was going to ask, if it's possible to do like a dry run of these installations, but I'm guessing because you're using Terraform, that's easily possible via a Terraform plan or something like that, right? Because I'm imagining this thing takes many hours to deploy, right?
Well, so what we are also doing as part of roadmap is we have integrated this with Azure DevOps. So now you can, if you have an organization within Azure DevOps, you can clone the repo, you can define your pipelines based on our documentation, and everything is available publicly, step-by-step process, how you can define those pipelines. As long as you have access to SAP software, which the customers will have, they should be able to go and deploy SAP systems using those pipelines. And what this pipelines is going to do is effectively step-by-step process. So it's going to deploy a control plane. It's going to deploy your infrastructure resources. It's going to build the VMs for SAP and then install SAP system on top of the VMs.
What I'm kind of seeing that's really interesting from this is I've always seen SAP as a kind of a big black box that you can move from one place to another, and it sits there, whether it's in Azure or it's on-prem, it's a big black box. What we're now seeing with the event grid announcement that we saw this week, and the stuff you mentioned from Ignite as well, the Azure Center for SAP, and the DevOps integration, is that we're kind of almost, I don't know if we're reaching into SAP and exposing bits of it, but there's a two-way integration now that's happening with the platform. Is that happening with SAP, and is SAP kind of becoming more modular as a result as well, or are we just bending the technology to our will to try and get the most out of it with from an Azure perspective?
Yeah. So if you look at SAP, there are a couple of layers, right? So one is the infrastructure layer, which is we are talking about the VMs and storage and compute. And that's, for us, that's easy to automate because that is something which is common across all the other workloads as well. It's the settings which are different for SAP, it's the configurations which are different for SAP, it's the security mechanism that might be different for SAP, right? And then when it comes to the application layer, which is where the users are accessing the application, then we are getting into conversation in terms of how do we expose some of the APIs that could be utilized within Teams or other channels around it. So, for example, Power Apps or Teams in that fashion. So that's again a different piece of work that our engineering team is focused on and working collaboratively with SAP.
And it's certainly fair to say we've seen high-level cooperation across the two companies for many years. We had the Embrace program working between the two, and I think great to see that kind of collaboration in all sorts of areas and the fruits that it generates. Yeah,
great. Okay, thank you. I mean, yeah, amazing insight, and the depth of knowledge you've got across SAP and Azure is amazing. And yeah, thank you very much for answering our questions. Was there anything else you wanted to cover off before we call it a day today?
Not from me. Thanks very much. Great to be on here.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming on. If that's all for the day, then we'll say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.